Tonight, we begin in a place most maps would ignore, the marshy lowlands of eastern England, where the River Waveney curls lazily through a patchwork of sodden pastures and reeds. In the year 1452, this region was not known for grandeur, nor for its lords or knights. Instead, it was known for something far more ordinary, and at the time, utterly essential: eels. Asterisk, you see, before money flowed freely through every hand and pocket, payments were often made in kind. Bread, wool, firewood, or, as in our case tonight, eels. Slimy, silver-bellied creatures slithering through the dark waters of England's fens became one of the most stable forms of tax payment and barter. It's strange to think about, isn't it? That one woman's entire livelihood could revolve around these slippery little animals. Asterisk, her name was Ellen Dow, a widow living on the edge of Beccles. Ellen occupied a modest wattle and daub cottage with a sod roof that sagged a little more each winter. She had outlived her husband Thomas by 12 years, and in that time had found something of a niche delivering eel rent. Every Lent and Michaelmas, Ellen trudged across 3 parishes to deliver a tightly bound coil of eels, 150 of them, to be precise, to the local priory. This, you see, was her land tax. Asterisk, land. Rent paid in eels was not as odd as it sounds. The Doomsday Book, the massive land survey ordered by William the Conqueror in 1086, records over 540,000 eels paid in rent across the English countryside. By Ellen's time in the 15th century, the tradition had slimmed down but still persisted, particularly in lowland areas rich in river life. Asterisk, for Ellen, eel delivery was both obligation and opportunity. She had no coin, no cows, and no heir. But what she had, thanks to the flooded banks near her cottage, was a ready supply of eels and the knowledge of how to catch them. She used a type of net called a putcher, shaped like a long, narrow cone, which she planted in a row between willow posts. Each morning, she'd wake before dawn, push aside her sheep's wool curtain, and walk barefoot through the freezing muck to check her traps. Asterisk, the smell was, as you can imagine, not pleasant. But Ellen didn't mind. Eels meant survival. They were smoked and eaten, traded, and most importantly, respected by the local reeve, who preferred eel pears to those who offered threadbare wool or half-rotted barley. Ellen had a reputation for delivering her eels on time and without squabble. Asterisk, now, you might wonder, what could a priory possibly want with so many eels? The answer is surprisingly practical. Monasteries were centers of both worship and storage. Eels were oily, protein-rich, and easy to preserve by smoking or salting. During Lent, when meat was forbidden but fish permitted, eels became a staple food. Some monks even believed eels had medicinal value, curing everything from fevers to melancholia. Asterisk, Ellen's deliveries were carried out with a quiet sort of ritual. She would bundle the eels into woven reed baskets, bind them with hemp, and walk the 3 miles to the priory gatehouse. There, the steward would inspect the coil, counting them by the loop, not the eel. 150 eels, when bound properly, made 3 sticks, the unit of eel taxation. She'd receive in return not money, but a chit recorded in the manorial rolls as payment rendered. Asterisk, there was no fanfare. No thanks, only a quick nod and a turn back to the fields. And yet, there was dignity in it. The same way there is dignity in the dry crease of a farmer's palm, or the stubborn bite of wind against a shepherd's cloak. Ellen lived modestly, but she lived securely, a rare thing in a time of crop failure, plague, and war. Asterisk, but what few knew, what never made it into the priory's ledgers, was that Ellen sometimes kept 1 eel out of every coil. Not out of greed, but out of caution. These spare eels were her insurance. She'd keep them in a wooden trough behind her cottage, feeding them scraps and changing the water weekly. They became her savings, her security, her strange, sinuous companions. She once joked to the priest that she trusted her eels more than the tithing man. Asterisk one particularly hard winter, the frost came early, and Ellen's nets froze over. No eels came, and the ground was too hard to dig for rush roots. She lived for a week on smoked eel alone, the ones she had secretly saved. She never confessed this, but that week changed her. From then on, she began recording each eel in charcoal on a board in her kitchen. A ledger of fish. A diary of survival. Asterisk stranger still, Ellen's neighbors began relying on her. When the baker's child fell ill, she gave them broth made with eel fat. When the blacksmith lost his income, she gave him 6 eels and a smoked ham in exchange for a repaired bucket. In this small, quiet way, Ellen became an eel banker, a kind of barter queen in muddy boots and a woolen skirt. Asterisk, she was never recognized. Formally, no coin bore her name, but the villagers whispered about her well into her old age. About the woman who fed half the town with what she caught in the marsh, who never asked for coin, but always asked for honesty in trade. Asterisk, and so one has to wonder, when we talk about economic systems and barter trade and peasant survival, why don't more history books mention women like Ellen Dow? Why does no one remember the eel counting board, or the currency that slithered through English rivers for centuries? Asterisk, could it be that the most reliable bankers in medieval England weren't behind abbey walls, but trudging barefoot through the mud at dawn carrying baskets of eels on their backs? Asterisk, to truly understand the odd but powerful role Ellen Dow played in her community, you need to look beyond her reed baskets and river traps and examine the strange web of medieval England's eel economy. This was not simply a case of one woman with a clever survival strategy. It was part of a much wider system that quietly ran on fish. Not the kind you buy in a marketplace today, but the kind that served as rent, as tax, even as a tool of diplomacy. Asterisk, in medieval England, eels were more than food. They were infrastructure. The Crown's own survey records from the 11th to 10th centuries, kept in dusty manorial rolls, note thousands of payments made in eel rent or eel render. In 1 year alone, the Abbey of Ely received over 50,000 eels. That was enough to feed the entire monastic community and still trade with nearby towns. Landowners demanded eel payments from tenants because eels kept their larders full when coin was unreliable and grain spoiled. Asterisk, Ellen's part in this larger system may have seemed small, but it was quietly powerful. Her consistency meant she was trusted, and trust, in a pre-banking world, was currency. While her neighbors fretted over poor wheat harvests or lost livestock, Ellen had leverage. If the bailiff delayed a repair to the footbridge she used, she could withhold delivery. If the reeve raised her tax without warning, she could negotiate. Few peasants had such leverage, but Ellen's eels gave her exactly that. Asterisk, as the years passed, Ellen's quiet influence grew. She had no title, yet disputes over wool pricing or bread weights were often settled by asking her opinion. She was not literate, but she memorized trade ratios better than most clerks. She began carrying with her a small knotted cord, each knot representing a successful eel delivery season. There were eventually 43 knots. Asterisk, what's fascinating is how Ellen's eel economy functioned entirely outside of coinage. The local lord preferred that his tenants pay in kind. It was more tangible, harder to fake, and easier to account for. Silver was often clipped, hoarded, or corrupted. Eels, meanwhile, were alive, weighty, and could be eaten or smoked on arrival. Ellen never needed to set foot in a market stall unless she chose to. Asterisk, one spring, a minor noble visiting from Norwich stopped at the priory and asked where the fine eel pie had come from. The steward replied, "A woman from the marshes. Paid her taxes on time, always does." The noble scoffed and said, "A peasant woman, feeding clergy? What next?" But the steward, without pause, replied, "She feeds half the village when the barley fails." She's the best tenant I have." That story, though likely embellished over time, was told and retold. Not for drama, but for what it implied, that Ellen's work mattered more than it appeared. Asterisk, the marshes Ellen relied on weren't simple backdrops either. They were dynamic ecosystems and dangerous ones. One misstep on the icy bank could mean drowning. Floods came unexpectedly. The water teemed with leeches, biting flies, and the occasional adder. Ellen knew how to walk the edges with care, avoiding the reed clusters where footing was soft. She could sense a change in eel migration by the scent of the water. Asterisk, by her 50th birthday, Ellen had taught 2 younger women her methods. Both were orphaned during a famine year and taken in by her for a time. In the spring, she taught them how to mend nets with boiled twine. In winter, how to store eels in clay-lined troughs. One of them, Isolde, later became the first woman in their parish to negotiate a full tithe deferral using eel trade as collateral. In that quiet marshland world, this was revolutionary. Asterisk, there were still hard seasons. In 1461, a bitter frost killed most river life for months. In 1464, an illness swept through the village, killing a third of the sheep. But Ellen survived each year with stubborn rhythm. In famine years, she gave eel stew to those who knocked at her door. In plague years, she tied bundles to fence posts for others to collect, leaving tokens in exchange: flax thread, turnips, a carved spoon. She never married again. Some whispered she had once fallen in love with a fisherman from Reedham, but he drowned one spring tide and she never spoke of it. Others said she simply valued her autonomy too much. Ellen's independence was not romanticized. In her time, it was considered odd. But no one questioned her when she spoke. The miller lowered his voice when she entered. The churchwarden looked her in the eye when she offered dried eel for the harvest feast. Asterisk, and then one year, her name didn't appear on the eel roll. Not because she had stopped paying, but because the priory had finally begun to accept coin. A new steward, trained in London, had no interest in baskets of fish. He wanted silver, and silver alone. Ellen was offered a chance to convert her trade to currency, but she declined. Instead, she bartered with her neighbors directly, severing the old tie with the priory. Asterisk. This change was part of a wider shift. The eel economy, once dominant in East Anglia, was beginning to fade. Rivers were being redirected. Wetlands were being drained for pasture. The monasteries themselves were under pressure. And so, after 2 decades, Ellen's eel rent came to an end, not with a confrontation, but with a quiet refusal. She simply stopped walking to the gatehouse. She smoked her eels at home. She shared them. She saved them. Asterisk, you can imagine her, perhaps at twilight, kneeling beside her butcher traps, gently lifting one to find it empty, then shrugging as if to say, another day. Her fingers calloused, her back stooped, but her dignity intact. She had never missed a delivery. Never. Underpaid. Never begged. Asterisk, and yet, as England marched toward modernity, coins clinking in more pockets, wetland cottages giving way to wool farms, Ellen and her eels began to feel like the last breath of an older world. A quieter world. One where trust was measured in fish, and survival wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. Asterisk, so what happens to a person like Ellen when the world no longer needs what they've perfected? What does one do with knowledge that no longer buys respect, or food, or safety? What becomes of the eel banker when eels no longer pay rent? Asterisk, by the late 1460s, Ellen Dow was one of the few remaining eelwives still practicing her trade the old way. The marshes were quieter now, not because the rivers stopped flowing, but because the economy had begun to flow in a different direction. Coin was rising in importance. The priory's new steward demanded silver pence instead of eels, and younger families were taking up wool production or day labor in the new market towns. But Ellen, well into her 60s, now remained committed to the craft she knew best. Asterisk, the world around her was changing faster than the rivers could carry it. Drainage ditches, sponsored by ambitious landowners, began reshaping the wetlands to convert them into fields. Once rich eel habitats turned to pasture. Even her familiar walk to the reed bank had become unfamiliar, interrupted by fences and border markers where there once had been moss and fog. Asterisk, Ellen didn't resist change, not out loud. But she chose to stay still while the world moved. Each spring and autumn, she still set her traps. Her hands, now knotted with age and stiff from decades of cold mornings, were slower. Her back ached with the weight of the baskets, but she moved with ritual, methodical, reverent. She always said that eels came to those who waited without worry, and they did. Asterisk, she had long stopped delivering to the priory. Her eels now went to neighbors, to friends, to the alehouse in exchange for cider. She never wanted coin, even when offered. "It rusts in your purse," she would say, "but fish feeds your bones." Her small ledger board still hung by the hearth, though the charcoal marks had faded with time and smoke. Asterisk, by 1471, she had trapped her last full coil, just over 150 eels. She smoked them all, slowly, over applewood, not for payment, not for trade, but for a final winter's store. That year, she grew weaker, not sick, exactly, just tired. She was seen less often near the marsh. Children, now grown, remembered her fondly. Some brought her things in exchange for stories. Others just came to sit near her fire. One boy brought her a silver coin once. She smiled and placed it under a cracked tile in the floor, where it remained untouched. Asterisk, when she died. In the winter of 1472, no official record marked the event. The church bell tolled once. Her burial plot was simple, a mossy mound beneath an ash tree. But a small crowd came. The miller, the blacksmith, 3 reeves, and the 2 women she had once mentored. Each brought an eel. Not cooked, not cleaned. Just a single eel, wrapped in rushes. They laid them at her grave like wreaths. Asterisk, there was something ceremonial in it. Not religious, exactly, more like a farewell to a custom, a lifestyle, a kind of economic trust that had no name but was deeply understood. The eel trade, in a way, was buried with her. Within a decade, eel rents had nearly vanished from manorial records across Norfolk. Coin had won. But Ellen had outlasted the shift, holding onto an older rhythm that had fed not just bodies, but relationships. Asterisk, years later, a scholar from Cambridge passed through the village and heard mention of her. Curious, he searched the priory records and found dozens of entries. Paid in eels by Widow Dow. No first name. No biography. Just deliveries noted by the stick 150, 150, 150. The scholar smiled, shrugged, and moved on. But the villagers still remembered her, not for the number, but for the reliability. For the way she made sure the baker's children ate during famine, or how she never asked for more than what was fair. Asterisk, one of the women she taught, Isolde, continued eel fishing into her 30s, though never at the same scale. Eventually she turned to wool weaving and married a carpenter. But she always said that her greatest education came not from trade, nor marriage, nor scripture, but from learning how to wait by the riverbank in silence, how to observe, how to give without excess and take without greed. That was what Ellen had taught. Asterisk, in time, the marshes changed completely. Dikes were built, fields planted over the eel beds. The only memory of the old eelways was a faint curve in the land where water once flowed. And the last visible mark of Ellen Dow, widow, eelwife, quiet economist, was a scorched piece of oak found under her hearth, etched with notches and bundles of 50. The final tally, 4,950 eels. Asterisk, but if history were fair, and it so rarely is, we might remember her not just for the eels, but for what she embodied, a kind of resilience that never asked to be admired. The dignity of showing up in the cold, of feeding others first, of trusting the river and oneself. Asterisk, so when we talk about medieval survival, or economic systems, or forgotten professions, it's worth asking, why do we remember kings and forget the women who paid their rent with fish? Who really held society together, the lords in their towers, or the eelwives by the water? Asterisk, and when the world changes around you, as it always does, how do you know when to adapt, and when to simply stay still and keep fishing? Asterisk, why it took 73 days to do laundry in colonial America. Let's begin with something ordinary, so ordinary, in fact, that it often goes unnoticed. Laundry, not the kind you toss into a washer and forget about while scrolling through your phone. No, this was laundry the way it was done in 1723 in the wood-fired, wind-battered colonies of early America, where washing your clothes was one of the most labor-intensive multi-week chores in a woman's life. Asterisk, in the small township of Dunstable, straddling what is now the border between Massachusetts and New Hampshire, a woman named Martha Pike was known not for being particularly pious or particularly pretty, but for one quiet skill she could get: a white linen shirt whiter than anyone else in the county. She had no recipe, no secret soap, no magic. Just time, a lot of it. And a process so drawn out and meticulous that a full laundry cycle, from gathering to folding, could last over 2 months. Asterisk, you might be thinking, how is that even possible? Let's break it down, step by slow, muddy step. First came collection and sorting, though not in the way we do it now. Martha, like most colonial women, owned very few garments, 2 petticoats. 2 shifts, that's a kind of underdress, 1 pair of stockings, a single bodice, and perhaps a linen cap. Her husband had 1 good shirt, 2 coarse work shirts, breeches, stockings, and a wool coat for Sundays. These clothes were precious, handmade, and patched dozens of times. Asterisk, laundry didn't happen weekly or bi-weekly. In fact, some households washed only 3 or 4 times a year, usually just before major church holidays or communal events. Soap was expensive, water had to be hauled, firewood was rationed. So instead of cleaning a little at a time, Martha-like, others would wait until the washboard season came, early spring or late summer, when the sun was strong, the air was dry, and wood supplies were somewhat stable. Asterisk, step 1 of her process was soaking. Not just for a few hours, but for up to 7 days. Dirty clothes were placed into a wide wooden tub and submerged in water mixed with lye, harsh alkaline substance made from wood ash. Lye would loosen oils, sweat, and stains, but it could also eat holes straight through linen if used carelessly. Martha had developed a feel for the right balance, a cloudy, grayish water that stung her knuckles just slightly but didn't peel the skin off. She would cover the tub with a wooden plank and leave it near the hearth, occasionally stirring it with a stick. The longer it soaked, the softer the dirt became. After soaking came the scrubbing and boiling, which could take another full week. Martha used a paddle carved from pine to press the garments down in the tub. The boiling was done outside, in a wide iron cauldron over a fire pit. She would lift handfuls of soaked fabric, wring them by hand, and plunge them into the bubbling cauldron, sometimes with added soap root, a plant that foamed naturally when agitated. The steam was intense, the smell overwhelming, a combination of ash, wet, wool, and skin oils. Asterisk, during this phase, clothes were stirred constantly to avoid scalding or uneven bleaching. This part of the process usually took 3 full days, depending on the weather. Rain could ruin the firewood or flood the yard. If Martha was lucky, she'd get 2 boiling days in a row. If not, the wash would stall. And all this just to get the clothes to a place where they were cleanish. Asterisk, after boiling came the rinsing stage, which required clean, cold water. That meant more hauling from the well or the nearby brook. A single rinse could take 4 barrels of water, and for Martha's load, she might need 6 full rinses to get the lye out. Her hands would be cracked by then raw from lye and water, stiff from wringing and twisting. And the clothes still weren't ready. Asterisk, next came bluing, an old trick to make yellowed linen appear white. Martha used smalt, a kind of powdered cobalt glass or crushed indigo, to tint the rinse water a faint blue. It didn't clean the fabric, but it created an optical illusion. Blue cancels out yellow, so the fabric appears whiter. This was reserved for the best clothes only, her husband's church shirt, her own cap. The rest stayed cream-colored, no matter how much lye they had met. Asterisk, then came drying, a stage that could take anywhere from 5 to 10 days depending on sunlight. Martha had no clothesline, just a flat board and the low bushes behind her shed. She'd lay the garments flat, pin them with sticks, and flip them every hour to avoid mildew. If it rained, everything had to be brought in and started over. Asterisk, but the longest phase was yet to come, bleaching. You might think bleaching was part of boiling or bluing, but in Martha's world, it was its own ritual. Over the course of several weeks, she would lawn her linen, laying it on grass daily to let the sun fade the fabric naturally. It might sound peaceful, but it was a relentless task. Each morning, the damp clothes had to be carried out. Each evening, they were brought in. If dew settled in overnight, it could yellow the fabric. If chickens wandered over it, the whole process was delayed again. Asterisk, over the course of 73 days, from first soak to final fold, Martha completed her laundry cycle. By the end, her hands were blistered, her back sore, and her patience thin. And still, the result was never perfect. A few shirts would stay gray, a stocking would shrink, a bodice would fray at the seam. But she would fold them carefully, place them in a chest lined with lavender or dried birch, and breathe a sigh of both pride and exhaustion. Asterisk, and then she'd wait. Another 3 months, maybe 4, before she dared begin the process again. Asterisk, so why, you may ask, did women like Martha do it this way? Why not wash one shirt at a time, or skip the grass bleaching, or just live with stains? The answer lies in a simple, powerful truth of the colonial world. Clothing was valuable, and cleanliness was a form of respect, especially for the living, the church, and the dead. Asterisk, when someone passed away in Dunstable, their burial clothes were selected from their cleanest linens. If your linens were yellowed or smelled of smoke, it reflected on your household. Laundry wasn't vanity, it was honor. Asterisk, but one can't help but wonder, what did Martha think about during those 73 days? As she scrubbed, hauled, boiled, rinsed, and waited, did she reflect on the rhythm of her work, or dream of a world where clothes cleaned themselves? Did she ever envy the rich, whose laundresses bore the burden for them? Or did she find, in the repetition, something calming, something like prayer? Asterisk, by now, you know that doing laundry in 1723 wasn't a chore, it was an ordeal. But it wasn't just about fabric or filth. It was about status, survival, and social expectation. And for women like Martha Pike, the work of washing clothes didn't happen in isolation. It unfolded inside a web of rules, customs, and quiet competition that stretched across town lines, family trees, and church pews. Asterisk, there was an unspoken calendar that guided everything. Certain Sundays required your best linen. Feast days demanded a particular level of starch in your petticoat. The minister's wife, everyone knew, kept a checklist of who wore what and how clean it looked at the altar rail. If your bodice was yellowed or your sleeves were rumpled, it wasn't just embarrassing, it was considered morally careless. Dirty collar could be mistaken for a dirty soul. Asterisk, and yet, beneath these judgments lay a kind of strange equality. Whether you were the baker's wife or the apothecary's daughter, you still boiled your water over fire. You still beat your stockings against stone. You still watch the sky for signs of rain with the same anxious heart. Laundry, in a way, leveled the field, reminding every woman that no matter her title or fortune, she was one cold snap away from mildew. Martha, for her part, developed a rhythm to avoid the worst of it. On Mondays, she did water tasks, hauling barrels, soaking fabrics. Tuesdays were for fire building and scrubbing. Wednesday was a rest day, though in truth it was more of a backache day. Thursdays were for rinses. Fridays for lawn bleaching. Saturday was for starching a skill all its own. Starch was made from boiled flour or potato, then brushed onto cuffs and collars and ironed stiff with heavy flat irons heated in the hearth. The result? A garment that stood like armor. But the starching process wasn't just about shape. It was about prestige. The stiffer your collar, the more labor it showed. And since time itself was a luxury in the colonies, heavily starched clothing silently announced to the community, this household has the discipline to care. Martha's collars were so well known for their sharpness that a nearby family offered to trade her a chicken every month in exchange for laundering their Sunday linens. She agreed, but only after inspecting their firewood. In town, women sometimes shared tips: how to make bluing agents from powdered iris root, or how to stretch wet garments over barrels to avoid wrinkle lines. But more often, they observed each other with a kind of quiet rivalry. The alley between two houses might hold two drying skirts, flapping in the same breeze, but behind them, two women silently compared fold lines, bleach tone, and hem seams. There was, however, camaraderie too. Martha and her neighbor Agnes had a deal. When one was boiling, the other helped stir. When one was too tired to carry barrels from the well, the other stepped in. These small acts were always spoken of. They didn't need to be. They were understood. It was laundry that bound them together. Not conversation or shared faith or even kinship, but the mutual, endless labor of keeping things clean. Laundry wasn't just a domestic act, it was political. During town meetings, local leaders decided when laundry lines could be strung across alleyways, whether river use for rinsing was permitted that season, and which days the communal fire pits could be used for boiling. In dry summers, wash was restricted to alternate weeks. In flood season, women stood knee-deep in icy water to retrieve clothes swept off bushes by sudden runoff. And if you're wondering where the men were in all of this, the answer is elsewhere. Men built barns, felled trees, and fixed roofs. But laundry was women's work and seen as beneath the dignity of male labor. The irony, of course, is that men wore the most complicated garments: double-cuff shirts, embroidered cravats, woolen hose with reinforced seams. It was the women, wives, daughters, widows, who kept these fineries clean with burned knuckles and sore wrists. One of the harshest punishments a woman could suffer socially was to be known as a sloven. It didn't mean she was dirty personally, it meant her linens were. If a widow's collars weren't stiffened, or her children's shifts were left unpatched, the town would talk. And Martha, who took pride in being the opposite of that word, worked harder than most to avoid its shadow. Even when her own strength waned, she'd press her skirts flat beneath a heated brick. "I'd rather burn my fingers," she once said, "than hear my name from another's lips." There were stories that floated through the town like fog of a woman who dropped a sock into the fire pit and had to explain why her child went barefoot that winter. Of another who used river water without rinsing and was blamed when the local minister's hands blistered after shaking hers. Petty, yes. But in a world where reputation could decide your daughter's dowry or your seat in church, a well-folded chemise was protection. Martha's deepest joy came not from the finished laundry, but from a strange, almost meditative moment: folding. She would lay a shift across her lap, smooth the corners with her palms, and whisper the name of its wearer like a blessing. Her husband, her son, herself. Each fold was a promise: you are seen, you are loved, you are present. In a time when emotions were rarely spoken aloud, this was how she expressed care. And so, laundry was not merely drudgery. It was a language, a symbol of who belonged, who tried, who endured. And Martha, in her quiet way, became fluent in it. Not because she had to, but because, in a world where she owned almost nothing, she could at least own the whiteness of a collar and the sharpness of a crease. But one has to wonder, when all the folding was done, and all the sun bleaching faded back to gray, did Martha ever wonder if it was all worth it? Could any shift, no matter how clean, protect a person from judgment, from change, from time itself? By the time Martha Pike reached her 50s, the rhythm of the laundry cycle had become something close to a ritual calendar. She no longer used charcoal to count days, nor kept a ledger like a merchant. Instead, the passing of time was marked by cloth. When the lawn was full of soaking shifts, it was spring. When starch ran low, it was nearly All Hallows. When bluing water froze in the bucket, winter had come early. Her life wasn't measured in seasons or sermons, but in the slow transformation of fabric from soiled to sacred. And yet, change, quiet, inevitable, was creeping into her corner of the world. The younger women in the village had begun adopting new habits. Some purchased lye from general stores instead of making their own from ashes. Others skipped the lawn bleaching entirely, content with nearly clean clothes that wouldn't pass the old scrutiny. And a few, particularly those closer to the townships, had begun sending small bundles of washing to a washerwoman near the river, an early form of outsourcing. Martha disapproved silently, but said nothing. Her own body was changing too. The years of wringing and hauling had left her joints swollen. Her left thumb no longer bent fully. Her back, once firm from lifting wet linens, now ached before the fire was even built. One morning, while hauling a rinse barrel, she slipped and bruised her shoulder. The laundry for that cycle remained half done for nearly 3 weeks. When she finally resumed, she did so with a kind of reverent stubbornness, as if she were finishing a prayer long interrupted. That cycle, her last full one, was the most difficult of her life, but also, in a quiet way, the most beautiful. She allowed herself time. She folded slowly. She mended seams not because she expected to wear the garments again, but because she could not bear the thought of leaving them undone. Each hem she repaired became a kind of farewell. By now, her household was smaller. Her son had married and moved to a nearby settlement. Her husband had died years earlier. The rooms echoed slightly more. The laundry pile had shrunk from barrels to a modest basket. And still, she treated each item as if the world rested on its care. Her own shift, threadbare, yellowed at the neckline, was folded with the same precision she had once reserved for her husband's wedding shirt. One day, the minister's wife stopped by to ask if Martha might be willing to teach a group of younger girls the old methods. She agreed on one condition: they had to stay the full day, from barrel to bluing. No shortcuts, no impatience. Only then, she said, would they understand the task. The girls arrived early, nervous, fidgeting, unused to the idea of earning knowledge with time rather than coin. She taught them how to test lye strength by dipping a feather in it. If it curled, the mixture was too strong. She showed them how to scrub seams without fraying the thread, how to twist wool gently, how to fold linen with the grain to prevent warping. Most importantly, she taught them how to stand beside the laundry fire without complaint. Your body will ache, she said softly, but your mind will calm if you let it. One of the girls, quiet, observant, asked Martha why she spent so much effort on clothes no one would see. Martha thought for a long time before answering. Then she said, "Because I see them. Because I remember what they meant when they were made." The following spring, Martha became ill. Not dramatically, not suddenly. Just quieter, slower. She didn't begin her usual laundry cycle. The lawn remained empty, the barrels untouched. People noticed but said little. When she passed a few weeks later, the village came together not with loud grief, but with gestures. Asterisk, they found her chest of linens carefully folded. Inside, tucked between shifts and stockings, was a small bundle labeled for burial. It wasn't her finest linen, but it was clean, bleached, smoothed. She had prepared it for herself, the final piece of laundry, folded in silence. Asterisk, at her burial, several women wore shifts she had laundered or mended over the years. Not because anyone instructed them to, but because it felt fitting. A few whispered that Martha had kept their households from falling apart during lean seasons. One woman, widowed young, said it was Martha's gift of warm stockings that had kept her baby alive during the harshest winter. None of this had been recorded, but it had been felt. Asterisk, years passed. The iron cauldron by Martha's shed rusted through. The lawn became a grazing spot. The reed baskets turned to dust. And still, in some households, a bit of her method survived. A particular folding technique, a favorite bluing recipe, a remembered phrase. Asterisk, and so, when we look back at history and wonder how communities held together, how people endured illness, hunger, isolation, it's tempting to look at leaders or laws. But perhaps we should look elsewhere. At a wooden paddle worn smooth by decades of scrubbing. At a line of white linen flapping in the breeze. At a woman who folded her grief into clean seams and taught others how to do the same. Asterisk, because history isn't always made by those who fight or rule. Sometimes it's made by those who simply keep things clean. Again and again, without recognition, without praise, without end. Asterisk, and so we must ask, what other stories of labor and care have we overlooked? Because they left no monument, only a well-washed shirt and the memory of folded hands. Asterisk, the town that ran out of toenails. Hygiene in 1780s Bavaria. You might not expect a story about hygiene to begin with toenails. But tonight, we're doing just that. Because in 1781, in the small mountain town of Oberammergau, nestled between pine-covered slopes and fog-slicked valleys in what is now southern Germany, a local doctor made a strange announcement. No more toenail trimmings could be accepted for barter. And just like that, a quiet, peculiar economy that had endured for decades, maybe centuries, came to a sudden end. Asterisk, to understand this strange declaration, we must first understand the world around it. Oberammergau was no grand capital. It was a town of woodcutters, stonemasons, weavers, and carvers. Its people lived humbly, built with their hands, and trusted more in tradition than in innovation. Plumbing, as we know it, did not exist. Baths were rare, and barber surgeons did double duty as bloodletters and tooth pullers. Hygiene was not considered a routine act of cleanliness, but rather a seasonal ritual, tied more to superstition than science. Asterisk, in such a world, toenail and fingernail clippings weren't just seen as waste. They were considered powerful. A part of the body, even after being cut away, held spiritual residue. Some believed they could be used in folk magic for blessings or curses. Others collected them as a way of keeping family connected, like a poor man's relic, tucked in cloth or jars. And in Oberammergau, a strange practice had evolved, bartering with clippings. Asterisk, it began as necessity. The poorest families in the hills, those without coin, chickens, or crafted goods, needed ways to pay for services. When winter came and the roads closed, they couldn't get to market. So they paid what they had, stored bones for broth, old teeth from ancestors, or bags of cleanly trimmed nails. It sounds absurd today, but back then, these items had meaning. Nails were burned in stoves to ward off illness. Some midwives buried them in floorboards to protect against miscarriage. A sack of trimmings could fetch you a ladle of salt, a twist of yarn, or a visit from the healer. Martha Udall, an old widow who lived near the sawmill, was known to trade in nothing but nail clippings and eggshells. Her ledger was a page torn from an almanac, marked with charcoal each time she gave a bundle of cleanings to the herbalist. In exchange for willow bark tea, she had no shame in it. "If a bird uses it to build its nest, I've done my part," she would say. But this was not just about barter. Hygiene itself, what we today define as simple grooming, was viewed through an entirely different lens. Washing the body too often was considered dangerous. It opened the pores, they believed, letting in the bad airs or cold spirits. So people bathed rarely, perhaps twice a year, usually around solstice festivals or religious holidays. Instead, they relied on surface maintenance, oil rubs, hair dusting with flour, and yes, meticulous nail trimming. Nail maintenance became almost ceremonial. Families kept bone-handled shears, passed down through generations for the purpose. Trimmings were stored in jars or cloth pouches and placed under beds or in kitchen rafters. Some even threw them into the town well during midsummer, believing it would ensure clean water. One superstition claimed that if a mouse stole your toenail, your soul would wander barefoot in the afterlife. But then, in the summer of 1781, something changed. A traveling physician from Munich, Dr. Albrecht Theiss, arrived in town. He had been trained in the newer medical philosophies of the Enlightenment ideas that hygiene, disease, and environment were physically linked. When he witnessed locals tossing nail clippings into the public fire pit, using them to cleanse the hearth, he was horrified. He wrote in his journal, "They treat the remnants of their body as if they were currency, superstition blinding them to infection and decay. I found one child gnawing at the tip of his nail to offer it to a sick goat." Dr. Theiss ordered the collection and burning of all stored nail clippings. He declared them a health hazard and banned their use in barter. The town was not pleased. At first, some simply ignored the order. Others hoarded their clippings in hidden drawers. A few angry tradesmen brought their old nail jars to the priest, asking for a blessing to override the doctor's rule. But slowly, under pressure and public embarrassment, the practice faded. What had once been a form of survival, an odd but effective hygiene economy, was now mocked as backwards. Martha Udall, the widow with the charcoal ledger, was never seen trading nails again. Some say she buried her remaining collection under a tree near the chapel, wrapped in sheep's wool. Others say she burned it herself, weeping. The truth is probably somewhere in between. But what's curious is this. After the ban, hygiene in Oberammergau didn't improve dramatically. Bathing remained infrequent. Illness came and went with the seasons. And while nails were no longer traded or stored, no one really replaced the practice with something better. The clippings vanished, but nothing quite filled the gap. So we must ask, what exactly did Oberammergau lose when they stopped bartering? In nail clippings? Was it really about sanitation, or was it something else? A way for the poorest to participate in the economy. A method of finding value in what others dismissed. A belief that even the smallest parts of us carried power. The ban on nail clippings had settled over Oberammergau like early snow quiet. At first, then heavy in its consequences. And while the townspeople had complied, more or less, with the doctor's decree, the act of personal hygiene had not simply vanished, it had adapted. The question became, if not through nail barter, how? Would the town now define cleanliness? In the months following Dr. Albrecht Theiss's proclamation, there was confusion in homes that had long centered their health rituals around grooming. Many no longer trimmed their nails at all, not out of laziness, but out of discomfort. The trimming shears, once used regularly with a reverence bordering on religious, now sat untouched. Children were warned not to throw clippings in the fire, not to hide them in the rafters, not to give them to animals. But no one offered them a new rule to follow. And so a strange uncertainty took hold. Martha Udall, though older now and rarely seen in the market, was still considered a quiet authority on household traditions. People visited her small wooden home on the edge of town, not for nails, but for advice. "How often should we wash our hands?" they would ask. "Is it true that vinegar in the wash basin keeps away fever? Where do you bury your wash water?" The questions piled like laundry in spring. And Martha, with a soft voice and sun-lined face, always answered patiently, "What your grandmother did begin there." This advice wasn't ignorance, it was continuity. For centuries, hygiene in the Bavarian highlands had followed family rhythms, not official decrees. A family might wash with rainwater strained through pine needles, or rub their feet with garlic to soften calluses and ward off bad humors. Hair was often powdered with rye flour or brushed with a hedgehog bristle brush once a month. And fingernails? They were not seen as ornaments, but as indicators of balance. Too long and you were careless. Too short and you were vain. 1. Of the more enduring rituals was known locally as Nageleben, or Nail Evening. It was held during certain moon phases, usually the waxing crescent, and involved the trimming of nails and hair in one sitting. Entire families participated. The idea was that the growing moon would carry away impurities. The trimmings were then carefully collected and either burned with time to cleanse the home or buried under a favored tree. The ceremony wasn't loud or festive. It was quiet, focused, repetitive. A meditation of blades and patience. Without nail barter. Nageleben became less common. The younger generation, increasingly influenced by visiting traders, soldiers, and clergymen from other parts of Europe, began viewing these rituals as backward. They preferred scented oils imported from Vienna. They mimicked the modern idea of bathing more often, but without access to regular soap or plumbing. These efforts were uneven at best. The nail clippings, once symbolic, now seemed pointless. But the older generation felt the absence deeply. They claimed that the air in town had changed, become heavier, less clean, though not in any measurable way. The priest himself noticed a shift in confessional visits. More villagers came to speak of restlessness, of feeling unmoored, of not knowing how to put things right. It was as if the act of grooming, once quiet and sacred, had lost its context. Dr. Theiss, observing all this from the stone house where he had set up his clinic, remained unmoved. He introduced new cleaning methods, ash soap, vinegar rinses, the use of stiff brushes for the feet and hands. He encouraged monthly baths, though few had the firewood or patience. He taught mothers to inspect fingernails for signs of illness. Still, something never quite caught on. People followed his advice, but without belief. What had once been tradition was now instruction. There was a brief attempt, led by the town midwife, to revive soaproot ceremonies in which women would boil chunks of the root to create a thick lather used for hair washing and body rubs. The sessions were held behind her home and were meant to replace the lost Nageleben rituals. But the women who came didn't feel the same connection. "It's not the water we miss," one of them said. "It's the reason to use it." This sense of loss was hard to name. After all, they were cleaner by modern standards. Nails were shorter. Scrubbing was more regular. Ley-based soaps were now occasionally purchased, especially by wealthier homes. But something had disappeared, a communal rhythm, a story passed through generations that now ended mid-sentence. And then, curiously, a new superstition began to grow, the scraping bowl. In the absence of clipping and storing nails, some households began placing a small wooden bowl by the hearth. It was used for scraping skin, dried mud, calluses, and broken nail bits, not out of ritual, but practicality. But over time, people began treating the bowl with the same quiet reverence they once gave to the trimming pouch. Bowls were kept polished. Some added bits of dried lavender or sage. It became a quiet new tradition, unnamed and unexplained. A strange circular return to ritual through utility. Asterisk, and it begs a question. Even when we abandon an old tradition, declare it irrational, ban it, forget it, does the human need for meaning simply recreate another in its place? Asterisk, is cleanliness ever really about health alone? Or is it about control? About making order where the world offers none? About declaring, in the tiniest ways, that something of us can be contained, smoothed, or folded even as everything else refuses to stay still? Asterisk, by the winter of 1782, Oberammergau was by many accounts a cleaner town than it had ever been. Dr. Albrecht Theiss had standardized soap distribution to households, mapped every village well, and ensured annual public cleanings of the central square. A record book from the period noted increased soap sales and a decline in visible skin infections. By all Enlightenment measures, the hygiene reform was a success. Asterisk, and yet, there was a lingering sense of unease. Not from disease or filth, but from something quieter, a cultural silence. Where once there had been laughter during Nagelabend evenings, now there was silence at the hearth. Where mothers once taught children to handle the nail shears with reverence, now they muttered, "Just throw it in the ash." The change wasn't just practical, it was emotional. And emotional shifts, as you know, tend to leave no footprint in the records. Asterisk, Martha Udall passed away during that same winter. There was no illness, no drama, just a slow fading. The women of the town prepare ill garments with careful hands, and though no one said it aloud, they folded her sleeves with the precision of Nagelabend. At her funeral, no priest mentioned toenails, of course, but several women carried, in their aprons, small cloth pouches, tied shut. They did not open them, they did not speak of them, but they laid them near the coffin's base, tucked between pine boughs, before the earth was shoveled over. Asterisk, perhaps they contained herbs, or bits of ash, or perhaps the last remnants of a once common custom preserved, not for superstition, but for memory, for the comfort of doing something when so much else had been taken. Asterisk, meanwhile, Dr. Theiss continued his work, unaware that his reforms had created not just cleaner bodies, but emptier rituals. He left the town in 1784, returning to Munich to publish a small pamphlet titled Rational Hygiene for Rural Communities. In it, he praised the success of Oberammergau and its residents' willingness to abandon medieval waste-handling behaviors. He made no mention of nail barter, Nagelabend, or the scraped bowls. Perhaps he didn't think it relevant. Perhaps he never really understood what had been lost. Asterisk, and what was lost? Not sanitation, though the town still faced outbreaks of illness like any other. Not dignity, though some felt diminished by the sudden mockery of their ways. What was lost was something subtler, the connection between the body and belief, between hygiene and history, between the acts we perform and the meanings we silently attach to them. Asterisk, for centuries, hygiene in Oberammergau hadn't been about killing germs, it had been about tending to the self piece by piece. About knowing that even the smallest part of you, even a crescent of keratin at the end of your toe, held weight in the household ledger. That nothing was too humble to matter. That even the discarded could carry meaning. Today, Oberammergau is known for its elaborate passion play, performed once every decade, and for its woodcarvers and alpine charm. Tourists come for the scenic beauty, the ornate chapels, the painted houses. But no plaque marks the era of nail barter. No museum display explains the scraped bowl or the seasonal rituals of cleanliness. That history has dissolved, washed away, as it were. Asterisk, and yet, ask the oldest families, the ones who still live on the edge of town in homes their great-grandparents built. They'll tell you stories About ancestors who slept with their nail clippings under the bed. About bowls carved smooth with use. About a woman named Martha who could judge a man's health by the shape of his fingernail and taught girls how to trim without fear. Asterisk, and perhaps they'll smile a little sadly when they say it. Because in every era, we lose something important. In the name of progress. And we rarely realize what it was until it's gone. Asterisk. So tonight, as you lay still and drift into sleep, ask yourself, what do you throw away that might once have meant something? What gestures do you perform without meaning, simply because no one taught you otherwise? And what would your ancestors recognize if they watched you tend to your body now, not with ash and oil, but with clicks and buttons and glowing lights? Asterisk, do we still have rituals or only routines?